The wind in the Montana Territory in 1886 did not simply blow, it scoured. It carried the grit of 1,000 miles of dry cut-grass prairie, picking up the alkali dust from the river bottoms and flinging it against anything foolish enough to stand upright. The sky was a brutal, endless expanse of pale blue that offered no shade and absolutely no mercy. It was a landscape that demanded hardness from its inhabitants. And the town of Bannock, huddled in the curve of the Grasshopper Creek, was a place built on cattle money, desperation, and the kind of gossip that could strip a woman's reputation faster than the wind-stripped paint from a barn. Clara Hart sat stiffly on the hard wooden seat of the buckboard wagon as it rattled down the main thoroughfare. She wore a traveling dress of dark wool that was too heavy for the heat of late June, but she kept her spine straight, her chin elevated, and her hands folded neatly in her lap. To anyone watching from the boardwalks, she looked the picture of composure. She was a lady of breeding, or at least she had been, before her father's heart stopped beating 6 months ago, leaving her with nothing but a crumbling house and a ledger full of debts written in red ink. Underneath the gray kid leather of her gloves, her hands were shaking. She pressed her thumbs hard against her knuckles to still them, praying the driver, a hired man named Jeb, who smelled of chewing tobacco and old sweat, would not notice. She was being delivered. That was the only word for it. The arrangement had been made with the swift, brutal efficiency of a cattle auction. When the bank called in the mortgage, Silas Crow had stepped forward. He was a man who owned half the valley, a man whose cattle brand was burned into hides from here to the Dakota line. He had offered to pay the debts. He had offered to secure her future. He had offered rescue. But rescue, Clara had learned in the last 3 weeks, was often just coercion dressed up in the Sunday best of charity. The wagon lurched over a rut, and Clara gasped, catching herself on the railing. "Steady," she told herself. "You do not have the luxury of fear, not anymore." They passed the general store, where 2 women in calico bonnets stopped sweeping the boardwalk to stare. Clara felt their eyes like physical touches. They knew. Everyone in this dust-choked town knew that Clara Hart was being traded for a stack of banknotes. She saw one of the women lean close to the other, whispering behind a cupped hand. They did not see a tragedy. They saw a climber. They saw a woman who had failed to secure a husband when her family had money and was now selling herself to the highest bidder to stay out of the poorhouse. A group of men lounging outside the Golden Leaf Saloon fell silent as the wagon approached. One of them, a cowboy with a hat pulled low, spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dust and watched her with a heavy, lidded gaze. It was the way men looked at a horse they were thinking of buying, checking the teeth, checking the flanks, wondering if the spirit had been broken yet. Clara looked straight ahead, fixing her eyes on the white steeple of the church at the end of the street. The preacher, Reverend Thomas, was standing on the steps. As the wagon drew near, he busied himself with dusting off his jacket, refusing to meet her gaze. Even God's representative, it seemed, was embarrassed by the transaction that was about to take place under his roof. The wagon pulled up in front of the livery stable, where a black carriage waited to take her the final 100 yards to the church. Standing beside the carriage was Silas Crow. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, dressed in a black frock coat that seemed to absorb the sunlight. His face was handsome in a severe, sharp-edged way, with a mustache groomed to perfection and eyes the color of slate. He watched her descend from the wagon with the proprietary air of a man surveying a new fence line. "Clara Hart," he said. His voice was deep, smooth, and utterly devoid of warmth. "You are on time, Mr. Crow." Clara replied. She did not offer her hand. He did not ask for it. He stepped closer, blocking the view of the street. He smelled of expensive bay rum and stale cigar smoke. His eyes swept over her face, searching for something, fear, perhaps, or gratitude. He found only the mask she had carefully constructed. "You look pale," he observed. "I trust you are not having second thoughts. It would be a shame to let the bank officers back into your father's house this afternoon." The threat was subtle, tucked away inside a concern, but it hit its mark. Clara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. "I am ready, Mr. Crow," she said. "Good." He gestured to a man standing near the heads of the carriage horses. "Mercer, get her trunk." Clara turned her gaze to the man he addressed. Luke Mercer. She had heard the name whispered in town, usually followed by a shaking head. He was Crow's foreman, the right hand of the Crow Empire. Luke Mercer did not look like the other cowboys. He was leaner, seemingly carved out of the same hard wood as the wagon wheels. His hat was battered, the brim pulled low, shading a face that had seen too much sun and too much trouble. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace as he walked around the horses. When he reached for her trunk, Clara saw his hands. They were large, capable hands, but the knuckles were scarred, the skin rough and weathered. He lifted the heavy trunk as if it contained nothing but feathers. As he secured it to the back of the carriage, he paused and looked at her. It was a fleeting glance, but for a second, Clara felt the air leave her lungs. His eyes were not like the dead slate of Crow's. They were dark, intelligent, and unsettlingly calm. He did not leer like the men at the saloon, nor did he judge like the women on the boardwalk. He looked at her with a careful, measured distance, as if he were gauging the distance of a storm. It felt safer than politeness. It felt honest. "Mrs. Crow will be riding with me," Crow said, correcting the title before the vows were even spoken. "You take the buckboard back to the ranch. Mercer, make sure the south gate is fixed." Luke Mercer nodded once. He did not speak. He climbed onto the seat of the buckboard, gathered the reins, and drove away without looking back. The wedding ceremony was a blur of heat and suffocation. The church was stifling, the air thick with the smell of old hymnals and dry pine. Sunlight slashed through the dusty windows, illuminating the motes of dust dancing in the air. Clara wore a veil of heavy lace that she had found in her mother's trunk. It was meant to be romantic, a symbol of purity, but as she stood at the altar beside Silas Crow, it felt like a shroud. The lace scratched against her cheek. It made the world look gray and patterned, like she was viewing her life through the bars of a cage. Reverend Thomas spoke the words quickly, his voice rushing as if he wanted to get the business over with. "Do you, Silas, take this woman? Do you, Clara, take this man?" "I do," Crow said. His voice rang out, claiming ownership. Clara's throat was dry as paper. She looked at the floorboards, counting the nail heads to keep from screaming. She thought of the ledger. She thought of the house she was saving, though she would no longer live in it. She thought of the secret she carried, the dark stain on her past that Crow had hinted he knew about. The year in Denver, the accusations, the ruin that had chased her here. If she did not marry him, she would be destitute, and a destitute woman with her history would be destroyed. "I do," she whispered. It was done. They walked out into the blinding afternoon sun. There was no cheering crowd, no rice thrown, just the wind hissing through the eaves of the church and the horses stamping their feet in the dirt. Crow stopped on the bottom step to speak with the banker, a short, sweating man who looked relieved that his investment was now secured. "Wait in the carriage," Crow ordered Clara over his shoulder. Clara walked toward the carriage, her legs feeling like lead. She needed a moment, just one moment to breathe before the prison door clanged shut forever. She stepped around to the shaded side of the carriage, pressing her forehead against the cool wood of the wheel spokes. Hot tears pricked her eyes. She fought them, biting her lip until it tasted of iron. She could not cry, not here, not where they could see. A shadow fell over her. She flinched, straightening up, expecting Crow's reprimand. It was not Crow. Luke Mercer stood there. He had not gone back to the ranch yet. He was holding a cinch strap, ostensibly checking the harness, but he was standing close enough that she could smell the scent of leather, sage, and tobacco smoke that clung to his coat. He saw the tears. The veil was still down, thick and obscuring, but the dampness had soaked into the lace, dark patches against the white. Clara froze. She waited for the mockery. She waited for him to call out to his boss. Luke looked at the church steps where Crow was laughing at something the banker said. Then he looked back at her, slowly, with a movement that was surprisingly gentle for a man with such scarred hands. He reached out. He took the edge of the heavy lace veil. Clara stopped breathing. He lifted it, just an inch, just enough to expose her chin, her mouth, and the terrified wideness of her eyes. He did not lift it high enough for the men on the steps to see. He created a small, private space between them, shielded by the carriage and his own broad shoulders. Clara, he said. He did not say Mrs. Crow. He did not say ma'am. He whispered her name. It was a low, rough sound, like boots on gravel. But in that single word, there was an acknowledgement. He was looking at her face, seeing the person beneath the transaction. He was reminding her that she existed. For 3 seconds, the world stopped. The wind died down. The shame that had been burning her skin cooled. Then, just as quickly, he let the lace fall back into place. "Fix your face," he said quietly. "He is coming." He turned and walked around to the horses, tightening a strap that was already tight. Clara stood trembling. A strange, violent collision of feelings wrecked her chest. Relief washed over her, the relief of being seen, of being recognized as human. But crashing into that relief was sheer, white-knuckled terror. Because in the eyes of Luke Mercer, she had seen something dangerous. She had seen a man who understood silence, and on Silas Crow's land, being seen by another man was not a comfort. It was a liability. She wiped her cheeks beneath the veil, swallowed her sob, and climbed into the carriage just as Crow rounded the corner. The drive to the Iron Ridge Ranch took 4 hours. The town of Bannock faded behind them, replaced by the rolling, endless expanse of the territory. The grass here was yellow and brittle, stretching out to the horizon where purple mountains cut the sky like jagged teeth. Silas Crow did not speak much. He drove with one hand, smoking a cigar, occasionally pointing out a landmark with the whip. "That is my north pasture," he said. 3,000 acres. That is the creek. It runs dry in August. But we have windmills. Mine, mine, mine. The word hung unspoken at the end of every sentence. The ranch house appeared at sunset. It was not a home, it was a fortress. 2 stories of whitewashed timber, a heavy wraparound porch, and a slate roof that looked strong enough to withstand a siege. It sat on a rise, overlooking a sprawl of barns, corrals, and bunkhouses, fences cut across the earth like scars, barbed wire glinting in the dying light. As they pulled up to the main house, a woman stepped out onto the porch. She was severe, wearing a gray dress with a high collar, her hair pulled back so tightly it pulled the skin of her face taut. "This is Mrs. Higgins," Crow said as he helped Clara down. "She manages the household. You will find she runs a tight ship. Mrs." Higgins bobbed a curtsy that was more of a twitch. "Welcome, Mrs. Crow. Mr. Crow has left instructions for your settling in." "Thank you," Clara said. Crow placed a hand on the small of Clara's back. It was heavy and possessive. "Mrs. Higgins will show you the rules of the house. Dinner is at 7 sharp. I expect you to be dressed for it. I do not tolerate tardiness, and I do not tolerate waste." Clara looked at the house, then out toward the bunkhouse. Men were moving there, washing up after the day's work. She saw the tall, dark shape of Luke Mercer walking toward the barn. He stopped, just for a moment, looking toward the main house. Even from this distance, she felt the weight of his gaze. Then he disappeared into the shadows of the barn. Crow's fingers tightened on her waist. "Shall we go inside?" Inside. The house was dark and smelling of lemon oil and beeswax. The furniture was heavy oak, imposing and uncomfortable. "Mrs." Higgins led Clara to the 2nd floor, to a large bedroom that overlooked the front yard. "Your room, ma'am, Mrs." Higgins said, "Mr. Crow's room connects through that door there." She pointed to a heavy oak door on the left wall. "You are not to enter the kitchen during meal preparation. You are not to speak to the ranch hands unless it is a matter of emergency. Mr. Crow prefers that you take your walks in the garden, not the open range. It is safer, Mrs. Higgins's eyes were small and bead-like. She looked at Clara not as a mistress to be served, but as an inventory item to be tracked. I understand, Clara said softly. I report directly to Mr. Crow on all household matters. Mrs. Higgins added, her voice dropping a register. All matters. Clara nodded. She was a prisoner. The velvet was just a little thicker here than in town, but the bars were steel all the same. Dinner was an ordeal of silence. They sat at a long table, separated by 6 feet of polished wood. Crow ate with precision, cutting his steak into perfect squares. The beef is from my own herd, he said, top quality. It is delicious. Clara lied. It tasted like ash in her mouth. Crow put down his knife and fork. He picked up his wine glass, swirling the red liquid. You are a quiet woman. Clara, I like that. My first wife, she talked too much. She had opinions on things that did not concern her. Clara kept her eyes on her plate. What happened to her? She died, Crow said flatly. The winter of '79 was hard. Pneumonia. He took a sip of wine, his eyes fixing on her. You, however, seem to understand the value of discretion. Given your history in Denver, it is wise to be quiet. Clara's fork clattered against the china. She stilled it instantly. You know, I make it my business to know what I am buying, Crow said. He smiled, a cold stretching of lips that did not reach his eyes. A false accusation of theft, wasn't it? From a boarding house where you were staying? Of course, the man who accused you had a reputation for preying on young women who refused his advances. But in the eyes of the law, and the eyes of polite society, the stain remains. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. It was the secret she had guarded with her life. I saved you from that. Clara, Crow continued softly, I paid the debts. I gave you a name that commands respect. You owe me. I am your wife, Clara whispered. Yes, you are. He stood up. Go to the room. Prepare yourself. I will be up shortly. Clara fled the dining room. Her legs shook so badly she nearly tripped on the stairs. She reached the bedroom and closed the door, leaning against it, gasping for air. She changed into her nightgown with trembling fingers. The silk felt cold against her skin. She walked to the window, looking out at the darkness. The moon had risen, casting a pale, ghostly light over the prairie. She heard the heavy tread of boots in the hallway. The handle of the connecting door turned. Silas Crow entered. He had removed his coat and tie. In the dim light, he looked larger, more menacing. He locked the door behind him. Clara stood by the window, clutching her arms around herself. Come here, he said. It was not a request. Clara took a step forward. Please, Silas, I am tired. The journey. You are my wife, he repeated, the words sounding like the closing of a ledger. And I have waited long enough. He crossed the room in 3 strides. He reached out and took her arm. His grip was hard, bruising. He pulled her toward him. There was no romance in it, no tenderness. It was the claim of a man who owned the land, the cattle, and now, the woman. Clara stiffened, her body rigid. She did not fight, for fighting would be useless, but she did not yield. You are hurting me, she said, her voice shaking. Crow laughed softly. You will learn to like what I give you. He raised a hand to touch her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. It was a possessive, terrifying touch. Suddenly, a shout rang out from the yard below. Fire! Fire in the south barn! The cry was frantic, piercing the thick walls of the house. Crow froze. His hand dropped from her face. He turned toward the window. Damnation, he hissed. Another shout. The water tank! The horses are spooked! Crow swore violently. He released Clara, shoving her slightly away as if she were an annoyance. Stay here, he barked. He grabbed his coat and a revolver from the dresser, storming out of the room and down the stairs. Clara rushed to the window. Below, chaos had erupted. Men were running with lanterns. Horses were screaming in the corral, their hooves thundering against the wood. Smoke was drifting from the direction of the water tank, though she could not see flames. In the center of the yard, illuminated by the swinging light of a lantern, stood Luke Mercer. He was shouting orders, pointing men toward the corrals, directing others to the pump. He looked calm amidst the panic, a rock in the stream, as Crow ran out onto the porch, bellowing questions. Luke turned. He looked up at the main house. For a second, his eyes met Clara's at the window. There was no fire in the barn. She could see that now. The smoke was coming from a pile of damp hay near the water trough, smoldering but harmless. The horses had been let loose in the corral, causing the noise, but they were not in danger. It was a diversion. Luke Mercer had not created an emergency. He had created a reprieve. He looked at her, his face unreadable in the shadows. And then he turned back to Crow, playing the part of the concerned foreman. Clara stepped back from the glass, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had thought Luke Mercer was dangerous. She had been right, but he was not dangerous because he was violent, though the scars on his knuckles spoke of violence. He was dangerous because he was gentle enough to notice her terror, and controlled enough to do something about it without leaving a fingerprint. He had bought her a night. Just one night. The house fell silent as the men moved further away to wrangle the horses. Clara stood alone in the center of the room. The connecting door was still open. She walked over and closed it. She turned the key in the lock. It was a flimsy barrier against a man like Silas Crow, but for tonight, it would hold. Clara returned to the window. The wind was still howling, rattling the panes of glass. Outside, the coyotes began to call, a lonely, yipping sound that echoed across the miles of empty space. The stars were cold and sharp, looking down on the Montana Territory with supreme indifference. She wrapped her arms around her waist. She was trapped. She was owned. She was in a place where the law was written by men with guns and money. But as she watched the lantern light bobbing in the distance, where a scarred cowboy was calmly lying to his boss to save a woman he didn't know, Clara Hart realized something. She wiped the last of the tears from her face. Survival here would not come from being a lady. It would not come from being good or polite or submissive. Survival would require becoming someone else entirely, someone harder, someone who could hide her tears not beneath a veil, but beneath a layer of iron. She watched the dark shape of Luke Mercer in the distance. "I see you," she whispered to the glass, and for the first time in 6 months. Clara Hart did not feel entirely alone in the dark. She turned from the window and blew out the candle. The room went black, but she did not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind, sharpening her mind like a knife. The weeks that followed the wedding were not measured in hours or days, but in the accumulation of dust on the window wills and the slow, grinding turn of the seasons. Summer in the Montana Territory was a crucible. The sun beat down on the Iron Ridge Ranch with a weight that felt personal, bleaching the grass to the color of old parchment and turning the earth into a cracked mosaic of dry mud. Clara Crow learned quickly that idleness was a trap. If she sat still, she became nothing more than an ornament in Silas Crow's fortress, a doll to be dressed for dinner and discarded in the dark. If she sat still, the terror of her nights would bleed into her days until she drowned in it. So, she chose to be useful. Usefulness was a currency, and she needed to buy space. She started with the ledgers. Silas had left them open on his desk one morning. A careless arrogance born of the belief that a woman's mind could not comprehend the intricacies of cattle yields and grain prices. He was wrong. Clara's father had been a dreamer, but her mother had been the one who kept the wolves from the door for 20 years. And she had taught Clara that numbers were the only language that did not lie. Clara corrected a miscalculation in the feed bill that would have cost the ranch $50. When Silas found it, he had stared at her with a flat, unreadable expression, then grunted. The next day, a stack of disorganized receipts was left on the dining table. It was not permission, exactly, but it was an allowance. She took over the supply inventory. She organized the pantry, counting sacks of flour and barrels of coffee. She learned to mix salves for rope burns and cuts, turning the back porch into a makeshift infirmary. The work gave her a reason to move through the ranch with purpose, to step out of the shadows of the main house and into the harsh, bright reality of the yard. However, moving through the ranch meant navigating the eyes of the men who worked it. There were 12 hands currently on the payroll, rough men with faces like cured leather and morals that shifted with the wind. To them, Clara was an anomaly. She was the boss's bought wife, a piece of softness in a hard world, and their reactions ranged from pity to predation. One afternoon, Clara was carrying a basket of linens from the wash line. The wind was whipping the sheets around her, tangling the fabric. As she struggled to pin a heavy quilt, a shadow fell over her. It was a hand named Dutch, a thick-set man with yellowing teeth and eyes that always seemed to linger on her chest. "Let me help you with that, Mrs. Crow," Dutch said. He stepped too close, invading her personal space. His hand reached out, not for the basket, but to brush against her arm. Heavy load for such small hands. Clara stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I have it. Thank you." Dutch smiled, and it was a greasy, knowing thing. "No need to be shy. Ma'am, Mr. Crow is away checking the south line. It gets lonely out here." He took another step. Suddenly, the air seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Dutch." The name was spoken quietly, without a shout, but it cut through the wind like a whip crack. Dutch froze. He turned slowly. Luke Mercer stood 10 feet away, near the corner of the bunkhouse. He was leaning against a post, whittling a piece of cedar with a long-bladed knife. He didn't look up from his work. He just sliced a curl of wood, the sound distinct in the silence. "The horses need water," Luke said, "and the tack room is a mess." Dutch bristled, his face flushing red. "I was just helping the lady." Luke looked up then. His eyes were dark and absolutely still. "You were wasting time." There was a moment of tension, thick and suffocating. Dutch looked at Luke, then at the knife, then at the hard line of Luke's jaw. The hierarchy of violence on the ranch was clear. Silas Crow owned the land, but Luke Mercer owned the men. Dutch spat on the ground, hitching up his belt. "Just being neighborly," he muttered, before turning and stalking off toward the barn. Luke watched him go until he disappeared into the shadows. Then he folded his knife and slid it into his pocket. He looked at Clara. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not offer empty comfort. He simply nodded at the basket in her hands. "Wind is picking up from the north," he said. "Best get those sheets in before the dust ruins them." Clara gripped the wicker handle of the basket. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." Luke tipped his hat, a barely perceptible motion, and walked away. It was their first real interaction since the wedding, and it set the terms of their existence. He would protect her, but he would not acknowledge that she needed protecting. He kept a careful, deliberate distance. He never touched her, if he handed her a ledger. He placed it on the table rather than passing it hand to hand, if they passed in a doorway. He waited for her to clear it completely before stepping through. In a world where Silas Crow's touch was a demand and the other men's gazes were a violation, Luke's restraint felt like the only promise Clara could trust. August brought a heat so intense it shimmered off the ground in waves, distorting the horizon. But in Montana, the heat was often a liar. One Tuesday, Silas had ridden into town to meet with the cattle buyer, leaving Clara and the crew behind. The afternoon sky, which had been a brilliant, searing blue, suddenly bruised purple in the west. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in the span of 10 minutes. A summer squall. Clara was in the vegetable garden, trying to salvage the last of the radishes. When the first hailstone hit the dirt, it was the size of a marble. Within seconds, the sky tore open. The wind screamed, tearing shingles from the roof of the shed. The horses in the near corral, sensing the pressure drop, went into a frenzy. Clara abandoned the basket and ran toward the house, shielding her head with her arms. The hail was coming down harder now, stinging like buckshot. Through the gray curtain of ice and rain, she saw a calf, one of the late-season births, panic and bolt through a gap in the fence, heading toward the creek bed, which would flash flood in minutes. Without thinking, Clara changed course. She ran toward the calf. Her skirts were heavy with mud, dragging at her legs. The wind pushed against her, trying to knock her flat. She reached the creek just as the water began to rise, a brown sludge of mud and debris. The calf was bleeding, stuck in the mud up to its knees. Clara slid down the embankment, the icy water soaking her boots instantly. She grabbed the calf around the middle, pulling with all her strength, but the mud held fast and the animal thrashed, knocking her backward into the water. She gasped as the cold shock hit her. She scrambled for purchase, slipping, the water rising to her waist. Suddenly, a rope hissed through the air. A loop settled over the calf's neck. The rope went taut. "Grab the tail!" a voice roared over the wind. Clara looked up to see Luke on the bank, the other end of the rope wrapped around his gloved hand. His boots dug into the mud. She grabbed the calf's tail. Luke heaved, his back muscles straining against his wet shirt. With a sucking sound, the calf popped free. Luke dragged it up the bank, and Clara scrambled up after it, clawing at the wet grass. She collapsed on the top of the ridge, gasping for breath, shivering violently. The hail had turned to a freezing rain that soaked her to the bone. Luke didn't waste time. He scooped the calf up in one arm and reached down with the other hand to grab Clara's arm. His grip was iron hard, steady and sure. He pulled her to her feet. To the barn, he shouted. They ran together, heads down against the gale. Inside the barn, the noise of the storm was muffled to a dull roar. The air was warm and smelled of hay and horse sweat. Luke dropped the calf into a pile of straw where its mother was waiting. Then he turned to Clara. She was shaking uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. Her dress was ruined, plastered to her skin. Mud streaked across her face. Luke stripped off his canvas coat. It was dry on the inside. He draped it over her shoulders, pulling the collar tight around her neck. "You shouldn't have gone after it," he said, his voice low but rough. "A calf isn't worth a broken neck. I couldn't. Just let it drown," Clara stammered. Luke looked at her. He was close, closer than he had ever been. Water dripped from the brim of his hat. His eyes swept over her face, taking in the mud, the fear, and the fierce, stubborn light in her eyes. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second. Then he brushed a clump of wet mud from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was electric. It lasted less than a second, but it burned through the cold that had settled in Clara's marrow. He pulled his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. "Stay here," he said. "I will get a blanket from the tack room." He walked away, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Clara pulled his coat tighter around herself. It smelled of tobacco, rain, and him. She buried her nose in the collar, inhaling the scent, and for the first time since coming to this God-forsaken place, she felt a strange, terrifying warmth bloom in her chest. In the weeks after the storm, the dynamic shifted. It was subtle, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. It was in the way Luke would pause for a fraction of a second too long when he handed her the mail. It was in the way Clara would find her eyes drawn to his hands as he worked the branding irons or mended a bridle. They spoke little, but their silence had developed a language. A glance across the yard meant, "I am here." A nod meant, "You are safe." A tightening of his jaw when Crow spoke meant, "I know." It was desire, yes, but it was threaded with danger. It was the feeling of walking along a cliff edge in the dark, exhilarating and potentially fatal. Silas Crow was not a man of intuition, but he was a man of possession. And possessive men notice when their property drifts. He began to watch them. He would sit on the porch in the evenings, smoking a cigar, his eyes tracking Clara as she moved through the house. "You seem to have taken a liking to the ranch work," Crow said one evening at dinner. "It keeps me busy," Clara replied, cutting her meat carefully. "Perhaps too busy." Crow said, "I didn't marry a ranch hand. Clara, I married a lady. From now on, Mrs. Higgins will handle the inventory. You will confine your activities to the house and the garden. But the ledgers—" Clara started. "Are done," Crow snapped. He looked at her, his slate eyes narrowing. "And I have noticed Mercer hanging around the main house more than is necessary. I will speak to him." Clara's heart stopped. He is only doing his job. "Silas." Crow smiled, and it was the smile of a wolf who has cornered a rabbit. "I decide what his job is." The restrictions tightened. Misses. Higgins began watching Clara with renewed zeal, reporting every movement. Clara felt the walls closing in. But the restriction only sharpened her need to understand the cage she was in. She found the key to Silas's private desk drawer purely by accident. It had fallen out of his vest pocket when the housekeeper took his suit for cleaning. Clara saw it glinting on the hallway rug. She waited until Silas was out inspecting the north herd and misses. Higgins was in the cellar counting preserve jars. She slipped into the study. Her hands shook as she unlocked the drawer. Inside were stacks of papers, deeds, cattle counts, banknotes. She flipped through them frantically. She found the file labeled Hard Estate. She opened it. There was the mortgage document. She scanned the numbers. Her breath hitched. The interest rate had been changed. The original number was crossed out and replaced with a figure that was illegal under territorial law. But worse, she found a letter from the bank manager to Silas, dated 3 months before her father's death. Mr. Crow, regarding the Hart property. "We have successfully delayed the refinancing application as you requested. The pressure should be sufficient to force a sale or foreclosure by winter." It hadn't been bad luck. It hadn't been her father's poor management. It had been a trap. Silas Crow had engineered the ruin of her family to acquire the land. And when the land hadn't been enough, he had acquired her. Clara put the papers back, her hands trembling with a cold. Clear rage. She wasn't a rescued bride. She was the spoils of war. She needed to tell someone. She needed to tell Luke. She found her chance 2 days later. Silas had ordered a trip to town for supplies before the fall roundup. He didn't want to go, so he sent Luke to drive the wagon, with explicit instructions to be back before dark. The drive was quiet. Luke kept his eyes on the road. When they reached town, Luke pulled the wagon up to the general store. "I have to load the flour," he said. "You stay close. I need to go to the apothecary," Clara said. "Mrs. Higgins needs headache powders." Luke hesitated, scanning the street. It was midday, but the town felt restless. "It's not safe for you to walk alone. I will be 2 doors down." "Luke, please." He nodded once. 5 minutes. Clara walked to the apothecary, her mind racing. She needed to tell him about the letter. But how? And what could he do? He was just a foreman. As she stepped out of the apothecary, clutching the small paper packet, 2 men stepped off the boardwalk, blocking her path. They were drifters, smelling of stale beer and unwashed wool. "Well now, look at this," one of them said, grinning to reveal missing teeth. "If it ain't Crow's little bird." "Excuse me?" Clara said, trying to step around them. The man moved to block her. "You look mighty fine in that dress. Too fine for a man like Silas Crow. Heard he bought you for the price of a mortgage." Clara felt the shame burn her cheeks. "Let me pass." "Or what?" the second man sneered. "You gonna scream?" He reached out and grabbed her wrist. His fingers were greasy and strong. Clara gasped, pulling back. "Let go!" The man laughed. Then, abruptly, the laughter died. The man's eyes went wide, looking over Clara's shoulder. "Let her go!" The voice was not loud. It was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a gravestone. The man released Clara's wrist instantly. Luke stood behind her. He hadn't drawn his gun. His hands were hanging loose at his sides, but his posture was coiled, radiating a violence that was all the more terrifying because it was completely controlled. He looked at the men with eyes that were empty of anything human. "Move," Luke said. The men stumbled back, tripping over their own feet. "Sorry, mister, just having fun. Move!" They turned and ran, disappearing down an alley. Luke didn't watch them go. He looked at Clara. He saw the red marks on her wrist where the man had grabbed her. His jaw tightened until a muscle jumped in his cheek. "Get in the wagon," he said. They drove back in silence. but the air between them was charged with a new, volatile energy. Clara sat with her hands clenched in her lap. She was ashamed that she had been weak, ashamed that she was seen as property by everyone, ashamed that she needed saving. But beneath the shame, anger was kindling. That night, the house was quiet. Silas was asleep, heavy with whiskey. Clara couldn't breathe in her room. She went down to the kitchen for water. She lit a single candle. As she turned from the pump, she saw Luke. He was standing by the back door, having just come in from the bunkhouse. He stopped when he saw her. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. Clara put the glass down. Her hands were still shaking from the encounter in town. "Thank you," she whispered. "For today." Luke walked into the room. He didn't stop until he was standing 3 feet from her. He took off his hat and set it on the table. "I should have killed them," he said. His voice was flat, matter of fact. "No," Clara said. "No more violence." Luke looked at her, and his mask slipped. For the first time, she saw the exhaustion in him, the weight of a life spent doing ugly things for survival. He didn't protect you because it was right. Clara, he protected you because you belonged to him. "I know," Clara said. "I found the papers. Luke, the mortgage. He rigged it. He destroyed my father to get the land." Luke didn't look surprised. "That sounds like Silas." Clara took a step toward him. "Why do you stay? You aren't like him." Luke looked down at his hands, the scarred knuckles, the calluses. "I tried to leave once," he said quietly. "Before I came here, I worked for a man in Wyoming. Big operator. I saw things I didn't like. I tried to walk away. He sent men after me. They didn't find me, but they found the family I was boarding with. Burned their place, killed the father." He looked up at Clara, his eyes full of ghosts. "I learned that when you run from men like that, you don't get away. You just give them a wider hunting ground, and you get innocent people hurt." Clara felt a crack in her heart. He stayed because he believed he was poison. She stepped closer. The space between them shrank to inches. She could feel the heat radiating from him. "You are not poison." "Luke." She reached out. Her hand trembled in the air between them. She touched his sleeve. The fabric was rough. Luke went perfectly still. He stopped breathing. He looked at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. He didn't pull away, but he didn't move forward. He waited. He let her decide the distance. Clara slid her hand down his arm until her fingers brushed his hand. His skin was warm, rough, alive. "Luke," she whispered. He turned his hand over, catching her fingers. He didn't grip them hard. He held them like they were made of glass. He stepped in, just one step. He was close enough now that his chest brushed the lace of her bodice as he inhaled. He was close enough to warm her. Clara looked up at him. The fear that had defined her life for 6 months evaporated. In its place was a want so sharp it hurt. Luke raised his other hand. He didn't touch her. He brought it up to the side of her face, hovering an inch away, waiting for her to flinch. She didn't flinch. She leaned into his palm. He closed the gap. His hand cupped her jaw, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. It was a touch of reverence. "Clara." He breathed. He leaned down. His forehead rested against hers. They stood there in the candlelight, breathing the same air, 2 broken people fitting their jagged edges together. He didn't kiss her. It was too dangerous, too soon. But the intimacy of the moment was more profound than any kiss. It was a mutual surrender. Then, the floorboards creaked upstairs. Luke pulled back instantly. The mask slammed back into place, though his eyes were burning. "Go," he whispered, "before he wakes." Clara fled to her room, her heart racing not with fear, but with life. The next morning, the reckoning came. Silas Crow stood on the porch, watching Luke saddle a horse. "Mercer," Silas barked. Luke led the horse over. "Mr. Crow, I have a job for you," Silas said. "I need you to ride up to the high country, check the line shacks near the pass, take account of the strays." "That's a 2-week ride," Luke said, his voice steady. "The roundup starts in 10 days. You need me here. I need you where I tell you to be," Silas said softly. He looked from Luke to the window where Clara was standing. "I think it would be best if you were away for a while. The air around here is getting stale, don't you think?" Luke looked at the window. He saw Clara's pale face behind the glass. He realized then, Silas knew. He didn't know everything, but he knew enough. He was separating them. He was isolating Clara, removing her only ally. And if Luke refused, Silas would have cause to kill him. Or worse, punish her. "I will leave within the hour," Luke said. "Good man," Silas said, smiling. Luke finished saddling the horse. He packed his bedroll and his rifle. He mounted up. He rode past the house. He didn't stop. He couldn't. But as he passed the window, he lifted his hand to the brim of his hat. A salute. A promise. Clara watched him ride out. The sky was bruised with purple clouds, a storm brewing in the mountains. She watched until he was just a speck against the vast, indifferent prairie. She turned back to the empty room. The silence of the house pressed in on her, heavy and suffocating. Silas was downstairs, satisfied, believing he had won. But as Clara stood there, she didn't feel the crushing weight of despair she expected. She felt something else, a cold, hard resolve hardening in her gut like steel. He had taken her money. He had taken her freedom. He had tried to take her dignity. Now he had taken Luke. Clara walked to the mirror. She looked at her own reflection. The frightened girl who had hidden under a veil was gone. She smoothed her skirts. She lifted her chin. Love, she realized, looking at her own fierce eyes, was not going to be a soft thing. Not here, not in this land of dust and blood. Love was going to be an act of war, and she was just beginning to fight. Luke Mercer returned to the Iron Ridge Ranch 5 days early, riding a horse that was lathered and blowing hard. The sky to the north was the color of a fresh bruise, promising snow. But it was not the weather that had driven him back. It was the tracks he'd found near the pass, or rather, the lack of them. Silas Crow had sent him to hunt rustlers, claiming 50 head of cattle had been driven off toward the high country. But Luke had ridden the fence line for 3 days and found no cut wire. He had circled the herd and found no agitation. What he had found, near the Slot Canyon, was a set of tracks made by a single horse, deliberately scuffing the earth to look like a drive, and a branded steer slaughtered clumsily and left to rot, meant to look like a warning. It was theater. It was a stage play enacted on the dirt of the territory, designed to manufacture a crisis. When Luke crested the final ridge overlooking the ranch, he understood why. 3 horses were tethered at the rail in front of the main house. They bore the brand of the county livery, but the saddles were stamped with the seal of the sheriff's office. Luke guided his horse down the slope, his stomach tightening. He had expected Silas to isolate Clara. He had not expected him to bring the law into the game. He left his horse at the barn, tossing the reins to a stable boy who looked frightened, and walked straight to the main house. He didn't knock. The parlor was warm, smelling of cigar smoke and whiskey. Silas Crow sat in his high-backed leather chair. Opposite him, with his boots resting on the polished hearth, sat Sheriff Baines. Baines was a man who wore his badge like a license to steal. He was heavy-set, with a face that had gone soft from other men's cooking and eyes that were constantly shifting, looking for an advantage. 2 of his deputies, lean men with hard faces, stood by the window. Clara was there too. She was standing by the sideboard, pouring whiskey into a crystal tumbler. Her hand was steady, but her face was the color of milk. She looked up as Luke entered, and for a fraction of a second, her mask slipped. Relief warred with terror. "Well now," Silas said, not rising. "Look who decided to join the party. I thought you were tracking thieves. Mercer." "There were no thieves," Luke said, his voice flat. "Just a dead steer and a lot of bad acting." Silas chuckled. "A dry, rattling sound. Sheriff Baines here disagrees. He believes there is a gang operating in the area. Serious men. He insisted on stationing a detail here to protect the ranch. And, of course, to protect my wife. Baines took the glass from Clara, his fingers lingering on hers a moment too long before she pulled away. Just doing my duty. Crow, Baines said, his voice oily. A woman like Mrs. Crow needs looking after. The territory is a dangerous place. Luke looked at Baines, then at Silas. It was a masterstroke of control. By inviting the law onto the ranch, Silas had turned the house into a prison cell with an official seal. If Clara tried to run now, she wouldn't just be a runaway wife. She would be fleeing police protection. If Luke tried to intervene, he wouldn't be fighting a husband. He would be assaulting an officer. You look tired. Mercer, Silas said. Go to the bunkhouse. The sheriff's men will handle the night watch. Luke didn't move. He looked at Clara. Go, she said softly. Please. Her eyes begged him not to make a scene that would get him arrested. Luke turned and walked out, but he didn't go to the bunkhouse. He went to the shadows of the porch and waited, listening to the wind pick up, carrying the first biting grit of the coming snow. The law felt less like a shield and more like another weapon pointed straight at Clara's heart. 2 days later, the snow began to fall in earnest, a white curtain that walled the ranch off from the rest of the world. The isolation was absolute. Inside the house, the tension was suffocating. Clara moved like a ghost, serving meals to the sheriff and his men, enduring their stares, their coarse jokes, and the way Silas presented her to them. A prized possession he was gracious enough to let them admire. But while the men drank and played cards in the parlor, Clara was fighting a war in the quiet corners of the house. She knew Silas had something on her. He had hinted at it the night of the wedding, and again when she had found the altered mortgage papers. But hints were smoke. She needed the fire. She found her opportunity when Baines and Silas were arguing over a land dispute in the study. Silas, usually so careful, had unlocked his safe to retrieve a map and left the heavy iron door ajar while he poured drinks at the sideboard. Clara was in the hallway, carrying a tray of coffee. She heard the clink of glass. She slipped into the study, moving silently over the rug. The safe was open. She didn't have time to search. She grabbed the top folder, the one made of thick blue legal paper that she had seen Silas handle with a smug reverence. She shoved it into the waistband of her petticoats, beneath her apron, just as Silas turned around. "Clara," he said sharply. "I forgot the sugar," she stammered, backing out of the room. She fled to the pantry, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She bolted the door and pulled out the folder. She opened it. It was not a mortgage. It was a warrant. It was from Denver, dated 8 months ago. Wanted for arson and attempted murder. Clara Hart. Clara read the affidavit, her hands shaking so hard the paper rattled. It was signed by Reginald Thorne, the owner of the boarding house where she had stayed after her father's initial collapse. Thorne had cornered her in the laundry room one night. He had been drunk, violent, entitled. Clara had fought back. She had knocked over a kerosene lamp in the struggle. The curtains had caught fire. She had run. Thorne had survived, obviously. And he had spun a story. He claimed she had set the fire to rob him, that she had tried to burn him alive in his bed. It was a lie, but it was a lie stamped with the official seal of a Colorado judge. Silas didn't just own her dead. He owned her freedom. If she left him, he wouldn't just hunt her down. He would hand her over to hang. The door handle rattled. Mrs. Crow? It was Mrs. Higgins. Mr. Crow is asking for the coffee. "Coming," Clara whispered. She hid the folder behind a sack of flour, smoothed her apron, and unlocked the door. She walked back into the lion's den, carrying a tray of coffee, knowing that the man sitting in the leather chair held the power of life and death over her. That night, she met Luke in the tack room of the barn. It was the only place safe from the sheriff's men, who were too lazy to leave the warmth of the bunkhouse stove. The air was freezing, smelling of leather and sweet feed. Luke was mending a bridle by the light of a hooded lantern. He looked up when she entered. He saw the devastation in her eyes. "What happened?" he asked, standing up. Clara told him. She told him about Thorne, about the fire, about the warrant in the safe. She didn't cry. She was past tears. She spoke with the hollow, flat voice of someone who has realized the trap has no exit. He has me. Luke, she said, if I run, I go to prison. If I stay, I die by inches. Luke listened, his face set in stone. He didn't offer false hope. He didn't tell her it would be all right. He knew the law. A warrant like that, backed by a man like Silas Crow, was a death sentence. I thought I was strong, Clara said, her voice breaking. I thought I survived Thorne. But I didn't. He just sold me to a different master. Luke stepped closer. He reached out and took her hands. They were ice cold. You're strong. Clara, you are still standing. Am I? She asked. Or am I just waiting to fall? She looked at him, searching his face. And you? Luke, why are you still standing here? You know what he is. You know what he does. Why do you stay? Luke looked away, toward the dark corners of the barn. Because I owe him. He said, money? No, blood. He took a breath, the vapor clouding in the cold air. 5 years ago, before I was foreman, Silas wanted a piece of land along the creek. A homesteader named Miller lived there. He had a wife and a little girl. He refused to sell. Silas told me to move them. He told me to make it hard for them. Luke looked back at her, his eyes dark with a self-loathing that was years old. I cut their fences. I ran off their stock. I poisoned their well. I did it because I was young and hungry, and I wanted to be a big man on a big ranch. He swallowed hard. Miller packed up. They left in November. Their wagon broke an axle in the pass. The blizzard caught them. They all froze to death. Clara stared at him. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Silas paid for their burial, Luke said quietly. He told me it wasn't my fault. He told me the world is hard and only the strong survive. He gave me the foreman job the next week. I stayed because I felt like if I left, their deaths meant nothing. If I stayed, maybe I could keep things from getting that bad again. I told myself I was paying a debt. Clara pulled her hands away. That is not a debt. Luke, she said, her voice trembling. That is a chain. Luke flinched as if she had struck him. You stay because you are afraid, Clara said, her voice gaining strength. You are afraid that if you leave, you will have to face what you did. You are afraid that without Silas Crow, you are just a murderer. Luke looked at her, his face stripped raw. You are right. Clara looked at the man she was falling in love with, and she saw the monster he had been. But she also saw the man he was trying to be. She saw the man who had lifted her veil. She saw the man who had saved the calf. We are both trapped. Luke, she whispered, he holds my past, and he holds your guilt. He uses our own shame to keep us in the cage. She stepped back to him. She took his hands again. We have to break it. How? Luke asked. We stop hiding. We stop hoping he will change. We stop hoping for mercy. We start planning. The storm hit its peak 2 nights later. It was a blizzard that would be talked about for 20 years. The wind howled like a banshee, driving snow through the cracks in the walls. The temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero. The ranch was buried. The sheriff's men were trapped in the bunkhouse, unable to navigate the 10 yards to the main house without risking death. The firewood pile on the porch was dwindling. Inside the main house, the cold was a physical presence. The fires struggled to keep the rooms above freezing. Then, the accident happened. Silas slipped on the icy porch steps while trying to check the thermometer. He fell hard, twisting his knee and striking his head on the railing. He was carried inside by Luke, who had rigged a guide rope from the barn. Silas was groggy, in pain, and useless. The power dynamic in the house shifted instantly. Clara took charge. She ordered Mrs. Higgins to boil water. She tore up sheets for bandages. She set Silas's leg with a calm efficiency that stunned Luke. She wasn't the trembling bride anymore. She was a woman who knew that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford, but the cold was relentless. By the second night of the storm, the house was dangerously cold. Luke brought in the last of the wood. We need to conserve heat, he said. Everyone in the parlor. It's the only room with a good draft. Silas was passed out on the sofa, dosed with laudanum for the pain. Mrs. Higgins had retreated to the kitchen near the stove. Luke and Clara sat on the rug in front of the fireplace, wrapped in buffalo robes. The house creaked and groaned under the wind. The firelight flickered, casting their shadows tall against the wall. They were alone in the circle of light. Luke looked at Clara. Her hair had come loose from its pins. Her face was smudged with soot. She looked exhausted and incredibly beautiful. "You were good today," he said softly. With Silas, he would have let me freeze if the roles were reversed. Clara said, "I know." Luke shifted. His leg brushed against hers under the robes. He didn't pull away. The intimacy of the storm was overpowering. The world outside had ceased to exist. There was only the fire, the cold, and the heat of their bodies. Luke reached out and touched a lock of hair that had fallen across her forehead. His fingers were rough, but his touch was light as a breath. Clara turned her face into his hand. She closed her eyes. "Luke," she whispered. He leaned in. His face was inches from hers. She could feel his breath on her lips. The desire was a physical ache, a sharp pull in the center of her chest. It would be so easy. Silas was unconscious. The world was white and empty. She wanted him. She wanted to be held, to be claimed by something other than duty and debt. But as his lips brushed hers, a feather-light contact, Clara stiffened. She pulled back. Luke froze. He looked at her, his eyes dark with confusion and hurt. "Clara, I can't," she whispered. "Why? Because I am still in the cage. Luke, and if we do this now, here, while he sleeps 10 feet away, it's just another secret. It's just another thing I have to hide." She looked at him, her eyes fierce. "I don't want to be your secret, Luke, and I don't want you to be my escape. I want to choose you, freely, in the daylight. Not like this." Luke looked at her for a long moment. He understood. She was refusing to trade one form of captivity for another. She was refusing to let her passion be something stolen. He nodded slowly. "You are right," he said. He pulled his hand back. He stood up. He picked up his bedroll from the floor. "Where are you going?" Clara asked. "To the door," Luke said. He walked to the heavy oak door of the parlor and laid his bedroll across the threshold. He sat down, his back against the wood, his rifle across his knees. "I will watch the fire," he said. "You sleep, Clara. No one comes through this door tonight." He was giving her space. He was protecting her, not just from the cold or from Silas, but from himself. He was proving that he could be a guardian without being a jailer. Clara watched him from the rug. For the first time in her life, she felt safe, not rescued, safe. When the storm broke 3 days later, the world emerged brilliant and blindingly white. Silas recovered quickly, his constitution as hard as his conscience. But as his strength returned, so did his cruelty. He had seen something during the storm, perhaps through the haze of laudanum, or perhaps he just smelled the change in the air. He saw that Luke no longer looked at the ground when he spoke. He saw that Clara no longer trembled when he raised his voice. He decided to break them. He waited until breakfast, when the sheriff and his men were eating hungrily at the table. "Clara," Silas said, buttering his toast. "The men have been cooped up for days. Their clothes are filthy. You will do their washing today." Clara paused. "Mrs. Higgins usually handles the washing. Silas, Mrs. Higgins is busy," Silas said, "and a wife should know how to serve. Scrub the shirts, by hand, in the yard." It was a humiliation. He was making the lady of the house a laundress for hired guns. Clara looked at him. She looked at the sheriff, who was smirking into his coffee. She stood up. Very well. She walked out to the frozen yard. She broke the ice in the washtub. She plunged her hands into the freezing water. Luke watched from the barn, his knuckles white as he gripped a pitchfork. He started to move toward her. Clara looked up. She caught his eye. She shook her head. No, she scrubbed the shirts. Her hands turned red, then blue. The pain was excruciating. But she didn't stop. She didn't cry. She scrubbed until the water was gray. And as she worked, something inside her finally snapped. Not her spirit, that had been tempered by the fire. What snapped was her hope. She stopped hoping Silas would be kind. She stopped hoping he would be fair. She stopped hoping he would die of natural causes. She looked at the house, at the smoke curling from the chimney where Silas sat warm and smug. I will outlive you, she thought. I will watch you buried in this frozen earth. That afternoon, while the sheriff's men were distracted by a poker game, Luke found it. He had been looking for a spare cinch in the old tack box at the back of the barn, a box that hadn't been opened in years. Underneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets, he found a ledger. It wasn't the official ranch ledger. It was a small, black notebook. Luke opened it. It was in Silas's handwriting. August 1881. Payment to R. G. for removal of squatters, $50. October 1883. Payment to Sheriff Baines for lost evidence, $100. January 1886. Payment to T. regarding Hart property fire, $200. Luke stared at the entry. Hart property fire. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't just predatory lending. Silas had paid someone to start the fire that had killed Clara's father's spirit and destroyed their home. Or perhaps he had paid someone to ensure the mortgage papers were destroyed in an accidental fire. Wait, he reread the entry. Payment to T. Thorne? Reginald Thorne? Luke turned the page. Wire transfer to R. Thorne. Denver. Services rendered regarding C. Heart accusation. The air left Luke's lungs. Silas hadn't just used the warrant as leverage. He had bought it. He had paid Thorne to make the accusation, or at least to pursue it. He had orchestrated the entire tragedy of Clara's life to trap her. Luke closed the book. His hands were shaking. Not from cold, but from a rage so pure it felt like holiness. He hid the book inside his coat. He needed to tell Clara, but he couldn't go to the house. Silas was watching. Help came from an unlikely source. Late that afternoon, a cutter sleigh arrived at the ranch. It was Mrs. Gable, the midwife from the settlement across the valley. She was a stern, practical woman who feared God and nothing else. She had come to check on Mrs. Higgins, who suffered from rheumatism in the cold. Silas couldn't turn her away without raising suspicion. Mrs. Gable entered the kitchen where Clara was warming her frozen hands. The older woman took one look at Clara's red, cracked skin and the exhaustion in her eyes. She didn't say a word. She opened her bag and took out a jar of salve. Sit, she ordered. She applied the salve to Clara's hands. Then she leaned in close. You look like a woman walking on a wire. Mrs. Gable whispered. Clara looked at her. Mrs. Gable's eyes were kind, but sharp. She saw. I am, Clara whispered back. If you fall, Mrs. Gable said, looking at the door to ensure they were alone. There are people in the valley who remember what kind of man your father was. People who don't much care for Silas Crow's way of doing business. It was a thin thread. A tiny offer of alliance. If I needed to send a letter, Clara whispered. A letter that couldn't go through the post office in town. Mrs. Gable finished wrapping Clara's hand. I will be passing through on my way back next Tuesday. If you have something for me, put it in the bottom of the mending basket. She stood up. Keep your head up, child. The winter doesn't last forever. Mrs. Gable left. Clara felt a surge of adrenaline. She had a way out. That night, she slipped out to the barn on the pretext of checking the chickens. Luke was waiting. He showed her the ledger. He showed her the entry about Thorne. Clara stared at the page. The truth washed over her. It wasn't just bad luck. It wasn't just her mistake. It was him. It had always been him. He paid Thorne, she whispered. He paid him to ruin me. She looked up at Luke. Her eyes were dry. The tears were gone. He took everything from me. Luke, my name, my home, my freedom. And he took my soul. Luke said, he made me a part of it. They stood in the dark barn, the smell of hay and manure around them, the wind rattling the doors. They were two people standing in the wreckage of their lives, looking at the architect of their destruction. Luke took her hand. He placed the black book in it. "This is the end of him," Luke said. "If we can get this to the U.S. Marshal in Helena, not Baines, a real marshal." "It's a 3-day ride," Clara said, "through snow, with Baines guarding the gate." "I will get you out," Luke said. "No," Clara said, "not just me, us." She squeezed his hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "I am done being a victim. Luke, I am done being a survivor. I want justice." Luke looked at her. He saw the steel in her spine. He saw the woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side. "We do this together," he said. "Together," Clara repeated. She looked him in the eye. "We end this, Luke, or it ends us." There was no romance in the words. It was a contract. It was a declaration of war. Luke nodded. "Next Tuesday," he said, "when Mrs. Gable comes back, we make our move." Clara turned to go back to the house, back to the prison. But as she walked across the frozen yard, she didn't feel the cold. She felt the heat of the black book pressed against her side. She walked into the house, past the sheriff, past Silas. "Good evening, Silas," she said calmly. Silas looked up, surprised by her tone. "Good evening, Clara." He didn't see the fire in her eyes. He didn't see the knife hidden in her smile. He thought he had broken her. He was wrong. He had just forged her. The weeks following the discovery of the ledger were a slow, grinding war of attrition. The snow had settled into a hard, permanent crust over the Montana range, turning the world into a landscape of white silence and gray sky. Inside the Iron Ridge Ranch, the silence was just as heavy, but far more brittle. Clara Crow moved through the house like a shadow, performing the duties of a wife while her mind worked with the cold precision of a tactician. She had the black book hidden beneath the floorboards of the pantry, wrapped in oilcloth. But the book alone was not enough. A book was just paper. She needed the human voices that echoed the crimes written in ink. She began to gather them, collecting fragments of truth like precious stones. It started in the kitchen. Mrs. Higgins, usually a fortress of propriety, had cracked under the strain of the long winter and the constant, menacing presence of Sheriff Baines's deputies. One afternoon, while kneading dough, she muttered about a cousin in the next valley who had been forced to sell his water rights for pennies on the dollar. He said it was legal. "Mrs." Higgins whispered, her hands punishing the flour. But he said the men who came to sign the papers wore masks before they wore suits. Clara did not press. She simply listened, filing the name away. Later, she spoke to the stable boy, a 14-year-old orphan named Toby who slept in the hayloft. He was terrified of Silas, flinching whenever the boss raised a hand. Clara brought him extra biscuits wrapped in a napkin. "You used to work at the Miller place, didn't you, Toby?" she asked softly, while he curried her mare. Before they moved on. Toby stopped brushing. His eyes darted to the door. They didn't move on. "Ma'am?" he whispered. "Not really. The wagon broke. I saw the wheel. Someone had sawed it halfway through." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty barn. "Sawed it?" Toby nodded, his face pale. "I saw Mr. Mercer fix the axle before they left, but the sawing happened at night. I think he knew. But he fixed it anyway so they could leave. He wanted them gone before the snow hit. He was trying to save them." Clara touched the boy's shoulder. "You are a brave boy. Toby, keep that to yourself for now." She walked back to the house, the wind biting at her cheeks. Luke hadn't just enforced the eviction. He had tried to mitigate the damage of a sabotage he likely hadn't ordered. It was a thin distinction, but it was there. However, if Clara was finding cracks in Silas's armor, the town of Bannock was busy reinforcing the walls around her. On Sunday, Silas insisted they attend church. It was a performance of domestic unity. He helped her into the carriage, his grip on her elbow tight enough to bruise. In town, the reception was icy. The women of the congregation, bundled in wool and self-righteousness, turned their shoulders as Clara passed. She heard the whispers hiss like steam. "Look at her," a matron in a bonnet murmured. "Silk ribbons in her hair while decent folk are rationing flour." "Ungrateful," another replied. "Silas Crow saved her from the street, and she walks around like she is attending a funeral." Temptation. That is what she is, a pretty face to hide a rotten spirit. The men were worse. They did not whisper. They stared. They looked at Clara not as a person, but as a high-priced heifer that Silas had acquired. They slapped Silas on the back, congratulating him on his acquisition, their eyes sliding over Clara with a mixture of envy and appraisal. "How is the filly settling in?" "Crow," the banker asked, loud enough for Clara to hear. "She is learning the bit," Silas replied, smiling his cold, shark-like smile. "She requires a firm hand, but she is learning." Clara stood still, her gloved hands clasped. She let the humiliation wash over her. She saw how loneliness was used as a discipline here. If they could make her feel entirely alone, entirely despised, she would have no choice but to turn to Silas for the only shelter available. It was a psychological siege. But she did not turn to Silas. She looked across the town square and saw Luke Mercer tying his horse at the rail. He did not look at her. He could not, but the set of his shoulders, tense and alert, told her he was listening. Luke was fighting his own ghosts. That afternoon, while Silas drank whiskey with the mayor, Luke rode out to the edge of the Badlands. He was looking for a man named Jebediah Stone. Stone had been a squatter on the North Range 3 years ago. Luke had burned his shack down. It had been an order, and Luke had carried it out with a torch in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other, numbing himself to the screams of Stone's wife. He found Stone living in a dugout carved into the side of a dry wash, surviving on jackrabbits and bitterness. Luke dismounted. He kept his hands away from his gun. Stone came out of the dugout, a rusty scattergun leveled at Luke's chest. "You got some nerve." "Mercer?" Stone spat. "You come to finish the job?" "No," Luke said. He reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out a sack of coffee and a pouch of tobacco. He set them on a flat rock. "I came to say I was wrong," Luke said. Stone laughed. A harsh, barking sound. "Wrong? You burned my roof. You put my wife in the ground. Mercer, the cold took her that winter because we had no shelter. You think coffee fixes that?" "No," Luke said. "Nothing fixes that." He took a step forward, ignoring the shotgun barrel wavering in Stone's grip. "I can't bring her back, Jebediah, and I can't rebuild the shack, but I am going to bring down the man who gave the order." Stone lowered the gun slightly. "Crow? You are Crow's dog. Everybody knows that." "Not anymore," Luke said. "I am done biting. I'm going to testify. If I do, will you stand with me? Will you tell a judge what happened that night?" Stone stared at him. His eyes narrowed, searching for the trick. He saw the scars on Luke's face, the exhaustion etched into the lines around his mouth. He spat into the dirt. "If you miss Mercer, he kills us both." "I won't miss," Luke said. Stone looked at the coffee, then back at Luke. "I ain't making no promises. But if you get him in a courtroom, I might remember a thing or two." It was a fragile victory, but it was a start. Luke rode back toward the ranch as the sun began to dip, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and blood red. Silas Crow was not a man who believed in coincidence. He had seen the way Clara held her head higher. He had seen the way Luke had looked at the sheriff during the storm. He sensed the rebellion like a change in the wind direction. He decided to cut the thread out at the root. The next morning, the sky was the color of iron. Silas summoned Luke to the porch. "I have reports of wolves in the Box Canyon," Silas said. "They are harrying the winter calves. Ride out and clear them." "Box Canyon is a dead end," Luke said slowly. "Wolves don't den there. It's too exposed. I didn't ask for a biology lesson." "Mercer," Silas snapped, "I asked you to do your job, unless you have forgotten who signs your pay." Luke looked at Silas. He looked at the sheriff, who was leaning against the railing, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. "I will go," Luke said. He knew it was a trap. It had the stench of a setup. But if he refused, Silas would fire him or arrest him on the spot for insubordination. And then he would be unable to help Clara. He had to play the hand, even if the deck was stacked. He saddled his horse, a roan mare with good stamina. As he tightened the cinch, he saw Clara watching from the kitchen window. He didn't wave. He just tapped his chest once, over his heart, and swung into the saddle. The box canyon was 5 miles west, a narrow throat of rock that ended in a sheer wall of sandstone. The wind howled through it, kicking up devils of snow and dust. Luke rode slowly, his rifle across his knees. He scanned the rim rock. He didn't see wolves. The shot came from high up on the south wall. It wasn't the crack of a hunter's rifle. It was the heavy boom of a Sharp's buffalo gun. Luke threw himself sideways just as the bullet tore through the air where his chest had been. It slammed into the pommel of his saddle, shattering the wood. The roan screamed and reared. Luke hit the ground hard, rolling instantly behind a boulder. A second shot chipped the stone inches from his head. Rock shards sprayed his face, cutting his cheek. He scrambled into the brush, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was pinned. The shooter had the high ground and a long-range scope. He checked his own rifle, a Winchester repeater. Good for medium range. Useless against a sniper at 300 yards. He had to move. He crawled through the snow, using the scrub oak for cover. A third shot kicked up dirt near his boot. He made for a crevice in the canyon wall, a narrow fissure that led back into the rock. He lunged for it. The fourth shot connected. It caught him in the left side, just above the hip. The impact spun him around and slammed him into the stone. Luke grunted, a sound of pure agony. He dragged himself into the darkness of the fissure, leaving a trail of bright, arterial red on the white snow. Back at the ranch, the sun went down. Sheriff Baines walked into the parlor where Silas was reading. "Done?" Silas asked, not looking up. "My deputy says the horse went down." Baines said, "Mercer crawled into the rocks. He is hit bad. The cold will finish him tonight." "Good," Silas said. "Write it up as an accident, a gun misfire while chasing predators. Or maybe rustlers. It doesn't matter." Clara was standing in the hallway. She heard every word. The world tilted on its axis. Luke was down. Luke was dying in the snow while these men discussed his death like a bookkeeping entry. Fear, cold and paralyzing, tried to seize her throat, but she strangled it. She didn't scream. She didn't faint. She turned and walked silently to the kitchen. She grabbed a knife. She grabbed a flask of brandy. She grabbed a bundle of clean rags. She went to her room and changed into her riding habit, layering wool trousers under her skirt. She put on her heaviest coat. She waited. At midnight, the house was silent. The sheriff's men were asleep in the bunkhouse, confident that the cold was a better guard than any lock. Clara slipped out the back door. The air was -10 degrees. She didn't go to the barn. The horses would make too much noise. She went to the paddock where the ponies were kept. She caught a sturdy pinto, bridling him with shaking hands. She didn't bother with a saddle. She swung up bareback, gripping the mane. She rode out, keeping to the soft snow to muffle the hooves. She knew where the box canyon was. Luke had taught her the map of the ranch in their quiet moments. The ride was a nightmare. The wind cut through her coat like razors. The wolves were real enough. She heard them calling in the distance. But she rode with a singular, terrifying focus. She reached the canyon mouth 2 hours later. The moon was high, casting the rocks in stark relief. She saw the dead roan mare. She saw the blood. "Luke!" she screamed, her voice tearing at her throat. "Luke!" The wind swallowed her cry. She slid off the pony. She followed the red trail. It led into a fissure, a dark crack in the earth. She squeezed inside. It opened into a small cave, a shallow depression protected from the wind. Luke lay against the back wall. He was gray, his eyes closed. His coat was soaked with blood. Clara fell to her knees beside him. She ripped her gloves off. She touched his face. It was ice cold. "Luke," she sobbed. "Open your eyes." He didn't move. She pressed her ear to his chest. A heartbeat, faint, thready. But there, she went to work. She cut open his shirt. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his side, missing the gut but taking a lot of blood with it. She poured the brandy on the wound. Luke's eyes snapped open. He gasped, a terrible, ragged sound, and tried to sit up. "Shh," Clara said, pushing him down. "I am here. It's Clara." Luke stared at her, his eyes unfocused and wild with pain. "Clara," he rasped, "you shouldn't be here. It's a trap." "I know," she said. "I don't care." She packed the wound with the rags, binding it tight with strips torn from her petticoat. Luke groaned, his head falling back against the stone. "You need heat," Clara said. She couldn't build a fire. The smoke would give them away. She lay down beside him on the hard stone floor. She opened her heavy coat and pulled it around him, pressing her body against his. He was shaking violently, the tremors of shock and hypothermia. "Hold on to me," she whispered. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his neck. She gave him everything she had, her warmth, her strength, her will to live. Slowly, agonizingly, the shaking began to subside. Luke turned his head. His cheek brushed hers. "I thought I died," he whispered. "I thought you were an angel." "I am not an angel," Clara said fiercely. "I am the woman who is going to save you." Luke looked at her in the dim moonlight reflecting off the snow outside. His eyes cleared. He saw the determination in her face, the raw courage that had driven her into the freezing night. "Why?" he asked. "Why risk it all for a broken cowboy?" "Because," Clara said, her voice steady, "you are the only thing in this world that is real." The truth hung in the air, stripping away the last of their defenses. Luke reached up with a trembling hand. He touched her face. "I have nothing. Clara, I have no name, no money, no future. I am a ruin." "You are not a ruin," she said. "You are the man who lifted my veil. You are the man who saw me." She leaned in. This time, she did not stop. She kissed him. It was not a kiss of romance. It was a kiss of desperation, of survival, of a hunger that had been starved for months. Luke made a sound in his throat, a mix of pain and want, his hand tangled in her hair. He kissed her back, tasting of brandy and blood and cold air. The physical connection that followed was not graphic, but it was profoundly earthly. It was a huddling together against the dark. It was Clara guiding his hands, Clara deciding that for this 1 hour, in this cave at the end of the world, she belonged to no one but herself, and she chose to share that self with him. She unbuttoned his shirt further, pressing her skin against his skin. The shock of the cold gave way to a fierce, burning heat. Luke was careful, even in his delirium. He let her lead. He stopped when she winced at a sharp rock. He waited for her breath to hitch. He murmured her name like a prayer against her skin. It was a reclamation. She was taking back her body from the ledger of Silas Crow. When it was over, they lay tangled together, breathless, the silence of the canyon returning. Luke kissed her forehead. "This changes everything," he whispered. "I know," Clara said. "We can't go back." "Not to how it was." "We aren't going back," Clara said. "We are going forward." Morning brought a sky of brilliant, blinding blue. Luke could stand, though he was pale and stiff. Clara helped him onto the pinto pony. She walked beside him, leading the horse, refusing to ride while he was wounded. They didn't go back to the ranch. They turned east, toward the town. "We need to get to Judge Holloway," Clara said. "He is riding the circuit. He is in Bannock until tomorrow. If Silas finds us—" Luke started. "He will," Clara said. "But we will be in the light." They reached the edge of town just before noon. They looked like ghosts, Clara with her hair wild and her dress torn. Luke slumped in the saddle, blood seeping through his coat. People stopped in the street to stare. They made it to the steps of the courthouse. Judge Holloway was coming out, a tall man with a beard like a patriarch. "Judge!" Clara called out. Her voice was cracked but loud. The judge stopped. "Mrs. Crow?" "I need to report a crime," Clara said, stepping onto the boardwalk. Before she could say another word, the sheriff's voice boomed out. "There she is!" Sheriff Baines came running from the saloon, followed by Silas Crow and 3 deputies. "Grab her!" Silas shouted. "She is unwell!" The deputies rushed forward. Luke tried to slide off the horse to stop them, but his legs buckled. He hit the ground. 2 deputies pinned him instantly, kicking his injured side. "No!" Clara screamed. Silas grabbed Clara's arm. He spun her around. "I apologize, Judge," Silas said, his voice smooth and dripping with false concern. "My wife, she has been suffering from hysteria. The winter has been too hard on her mind. She ran off last night in a fit of madness. And this man, he took advantage of her condition." "It's a lie," Clara shouted. "He tried to kill Luke. He is a murderer." The crowd gathered. They looked at Clara, wild-eyed, disheveled, shouting accusations. Then they looked at Silas, calm, well-dressed, the grieving husband. "She is unstable," Silas said sadly. "She imagines things. She claims I am trying to hurt her, me, the man who saved her from debt." Clara looked at the faces in the crowd. She saw doubt. She saw the prejudice she had fought for months closing in like a noose. A woman screaming in the street was crazy. A rich man speaking calmly was sane. She stopped struggling. She went perfectly still. "I'm not mad. Silas," she said. Her voice wasn't a scream anymore. It was cold and clear, carrying over the wind. "I am not mad. I am owned. And I am done being owned." She looked at the judge. "Ask him about the ledger," she said. "Ask him about Reginald Thorne." Silas's eyes flickered. He tightened his grip on her arm until she gasped. "Enough," he hissed. "Sheriff, take Mr. Mercer into custody for kidnapping and assault," Silas ordered. "And I will take my wife home. She needs rest and isolation." The sheriff dragged Luke up. Luke was bleeding heavily now. He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a terrible helplessness. "Clara!" he roared. "Don't let them—" A rifle butt slammed into his stomach. He doubled over. Clara was dragged toward Silas's carriage. "Wait," it was a small voice. A man stepped out of the crowd. It was the shopkeeper, Mr. Henderson. I heard them talking." "Mr. Henderson said nervously. "Last month, Mr. Crow and the sheriff, about paying someone in Denver." Silas turned his slate eyes on the shopkeeper. "You must be mistaken. Henderson, the wind plays tricks. I heard it too," another voice said. "It was Mrs. Gable, the midwife. She stepped off the boardwalk, and I saw the bruises on her arm 3 weeks ago. Silas Crow. Those weren't from no fall. It was a ripple, not a wave, but a ripple. 2 people, just 2. But it was enough to make the judge pause. "Sheriff," the judge said, "hold the prisoner here. Do not take him to the county jail yet. I want to hear this testimony." Silas's face hardened. "This is a domestic matter. Judge, not if there is an allegation of murder?" The judge said, but Silas was faster. He already had Clara in the carriage. His deputies were mounted. "We will discuss this at the ranch." "Judge," Silas said, "I am taking my wife home." He cracked the whip. The carriage surged forward. Clara was thrown back against the seat. She watched the town recede. She saw Luke being held by the sheriff, blood on his face. Watching her go, she saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't defeat. It was the look of a man who has nothing left to lose. The carriage rattled out of town, kicking up dust. Clara sat straight. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She looked at Silas. "You can take me back," she said quietly. "But you can't keep me." Silas didn't answer. He just drove the horses harder, running from the truth that was chasing him. Behind them, in the dusty street of Bannock, Luke Mercer spat blood onto the ground. "Get him to the cell," the sheriff ordered. Luke let them drag him, but his mind was already working. He knew the layout of the jail. He knew which deputy was a coward. And he knew that legal justice moved too slow for men like Silas Crow. Predators moved fast. Luke would have to move faster. He looked at the horizon where the carriage had disappeared. "I am coming," he promised silently. "And I am bringing hell with me." The cell in the basement of the Bannock courthouse smelled of damp stone, unwashed bodies, and the copper tang of old blood. Luke Mercer sat on the edge of the cot, his side throbbing with a dull, rhythmic heat where the bullet had torn through him. He did not touch the bandage. He simply breathed, counting the seconds, waiting for the morning light to hit the high barred window. Sheriff Baines sat at the desk at the end of the corridor, his boots up, whittling a stick. He was whistling a tune, off-key and cheerful. It was the sound of a man who believed he had won. "You are wasting your time." "Mercer," Baines called out. Judge Holloway is riding out at noon. Once he is gone, you and I are going to have a long conversation about resisting arrest." Luke stood up. The movement cost him, sending a spike of pain up his ribs. But he did not show it. He walked to the bars. "Get the judge," Luke said. Baines laughed. "The judge is busy having breakfast. He doesn't have time for a rustler. Tell him I want to confess," Luke said. Baines stopped whittling. He looked at Luke, his eyes narrowing. "Confess to what?" "To the Miller family," Luke said. "And to the fire at the Hart place." Baines slowly lowered his feet to the floor. The smile vanished. "That is ancient history." "It is murder," Luke said, his voice dropping to a gravelly low. "And if you don't fetch the judge, I will start shouting the details so loud that every clerk and shopkeeper on Main Street hears them. I will tell them how much Silas Crow paid you to lose the evidence. $100, wasn't it?" Baines stared at him. The threat was real. A public confession before a trial could not be silenced without a bullet. And shooting a prisoner in a cell was messy, even for Baines. "I will get him," Baines spat, "but you better keep your mouth shut about the money." 20 minutes later, Judge Holloway stood outside the cell. He looked tired, his beard gray and severe in the dim light. Beside him stood a man Luke had only heard of but never met. USS, Marshal and Elias Vance. Vance was a legend in the territory, a man who had cleaned up the gold camps in the 70s. He wore a long duster and a look of permanent skepticism. "You have something to say?" "Mr. Mercer?" the judge asked. "I do," Luke said, "but not to the sheriff." Baines bristled, but Vance held up a hand. "Step outside, Sheriff." When the heavy door clanged shut, Luke looked at the two men. He gripped the iron bars. "I am guilty," Luke said plainly. 5 years ago, I cut the fences at the Miller homestead. I helped drive them out. They died in the past because of what I did. I am ready to hang for that." The judge's face softened slightly, but his eyes remained hard. "That is a heavy admission, son." "I am not asking for mercy," Luke continued. "I am asking for a deal. You let me ride out to the Iron Ridge Ranch today. You let me finish this, and when the sun goes down, I will surrender to you." "Why should we let a confessed killer out of this cell?" Marshal Vance asked. His voice was like dry leaves scraping together. "Because Silas Crow is the one who gave the order," Luke said. "And right now, he is holding a woman prisoner who has the proof of every crime he has committed for 20 years. If you leave me here, she dies, and Crow walks away." Vance looked at the judge. "I have heard rumors about Crow. The land office in Helena has a file on him 3 inches thick, but no witnesses." "I have a witness," Luke said, "and she has the ledger." "Who else can you trust?" the judge asked. "If we move on Crow, we need men who aren't on his payroll." "There is a rancher named Garrett," Luke said. "He runs the spread south of the creek. Crow poisoned his water last summer. He hates Silas more than he loves his own life." Vance nodded slowly. "I know Garrett. He is a hard man, but honest." The marshal unlocked the cell door. "You have until sunset. Mercer," Vance said. "If you run, I will hunt you down." Luke stepped out, the pain in his side sharp and clarifying. "I am not running. Marshal, I am done running. At the Iron Ridge Ranch, the atmosphere was taut as a bowstring. Silas Crow was preparing for a cattle sale. It was hasty, unplanned, a liquidation disguised as business. He had invited buyers from as far as Idaho, men who asked few questions if the price was right. The corrals were full of lowing cattle, the dust thick in the air. Clara Crow watched from the window of the study. She saw the men arriving, rough men in dusters, eyeing the stock. She saw the sheriff's deputies posted at the gates, shotguns in the crooks of their arms. She was a prisoner in her own home, but she was no longer a victim. Silas entered the room. He was dressed in his finest suit, smelling of bay rum and arrogance. "You will come downstairs. Clara," he said. "You will serve coffee to the buyers. You will smile. You will show them that everything is in order." "And if I don't?" Clara asked, not turning from the window. Silas walked over to her. He didn't strike her. Instead, he leaned close, his voice a poisonous whisper. Then I will have you committed to the asylum in Warm Springs tomorrow morning. Doctor, Evans has already signed the papers. He agrees that your hysteria regarding the fire makes you a danger to yourself." Clara turned to face him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were dry and clear. "You are afraid, Silas." "I am a businessman," Silas corrected, "and I am closing a deal." He turned to leave. "One more thing," Clara said. He paused at the door. "Did you watch the fire?" she asked. "When my father's hopes burned, did you stand there and watch? Or did you pay someone else to do that too?" Silas smiled, and for the first time, the mask slipped completely. It wasn't anger she saw, it was boredom. "I didn't have to watch. Clara, I knew the wind would do the work. That is the difference between us. You think the world cares about fairness. I know the world belongs to the men who strike the match." He walked out, closing the door with a click. Clara waited until his footsteps faded. She didn't panic. She moved. She went to the pantry. She knelt and pried up the loose floorboard behind the sack of potatoes. The black ledger was there, wrapped in oilcloth. She took it out, but she needed more. She needed the key to the desk. She went into the hallway. The house was bustling with the arrival of the buyers. Mrs. Higgins was distracted in the kitchen. Clara slipped into the dining room where Silas's coat hung on the rack. She felt the pockets. Nothing. She looked at the desk in the corner. Locked. She took a hairpin from her bun. It was a trick Luke had shown her. Once, when he fixed a jammed lock on the smokehouse. Tension and a little twist. He had said, she worked the pin into the mechanism. Her hands were shaking, but she forced them to still. She felt the tumbler click. The drawer slid open. There, sitting on top of the stack, was the letter from the bank, and underneath it, a receipt signed by Reginald Thorne. She shoved the papers into her bodice, next to her skin. She grabbed the ledger. She checked her reflection in the mirror. She smoothed her hair. She pinched her cheeks to bring back the color. She looked like the dutiful wife. She felt like an executioner. She walked out to the porch. The yard was a chaotic sea of cattle and men. The noise was deafening, calves bawling, men shouting, the crack of whips. The air smelled of manure, dust, and sweat. Silas stood by the main corral, holding court with 3 buyers. He looked powerful, untouchable. Then, the south gate exploded inward. It wasn't a raid, it was a procession. Luke Mercer rode in front, sitting tall in the saddle despite the blood that had seeped through his fresh bandages. Flanking him was Marshal Vance, his badge glinting in the harsh sunlight. Behind them rode Judge Holloway and 10 men from Garrett's ranch, all heavily armed. The chaos in the yard died instantly. The buyers stepped back, sensing trouble. The sheriff's deputies raised their shotguns, but they wavered when they saw the U.S. Marshal? Silas Crow turned slowly. His face went rigid. "Get off my land," he shouted. "You have no authority here. I have a warrant." Marshal Vance called out, his voice cutting through the wind. "For the arrest of Silas Crow." "On what grounds?" Silas sneered. Stepping forward, the word of a disgruntled employee? "Mercer is a thief and a liar." "On the grounds of murder, theft, and extortion," Luke said. Luke dismounted. He walked toward the corral gate. He didn't draw his gun. He walked with the steady, terrifying purpose of a man who has already accepted his own death. Silas laughed. It was a brittle, cracking sound. "You have no proof. You have nothing but stories." Clara stepped off the porch. "I have the proof. Silas." Her voice was not loud, but in the sudden silence of the yard, it carried like a bell. Every head turned. Silas spun around. Clara walked down the steps. She held the black ledger in one hand and the letters in the other. The wind caught her skirts, whipping them around her legs. But she moved with a queen's grace. "Clara," Silas warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Go inside." "No," Clara said. She walked past him, toward the marshal. "This is his personal ledger," she said, holding it up. "It lists the payments to the men who burned my father's home. It lists the payment to Sheriff Baines. And this," she held up the letter, This is the receipt from the man in Denver who accused me of a crime I didn't commit. Silas paid him $500 to destroy my reputation, so he could buy me cheap. The buyers looked at Silas. They looked at the papers. The illusion of the respectable cattle baron shattered, leaving only the predator underneath. Silas's face contorted. The vein in his temple pulsed. He realized he was cornered. The law was here. The witnesses were here. The proof was in the open air. He moved faster than anyone expected. He lunged at Clara. He grabbed her by the hair, jerking her back. He pulled his revolver and jammed the barrel against her temple. "Back!" he screamed. "Back, or I scatter her brains on the dirt!" The yard froze. The marshal raised his rifle, but he couldn't fire. Silas was using Clara's body as a shield, crouching behind her. Luke stopped 10 feet away. He went perfectly still. His hand hovered over his gun, but he didn't draw. "Let her go, Silas," Luke said. "It's over." "It's not over until I say it is," Silas yelled. "I built this valley. I own this town. You think a whore and a traitor can take it from me?" He dragged Clara backward toward the barn, the gun digging into her skin. Clara felt the cold metal against her skull. She smelled Silas's sweat, the sour scent of fear. She looked at Luke. Luke's eyes were locked on hers. He was terrified. For the first time, she saw the fear that lived behind his calm. He would not shoot. He would let Silas go before he risked hurting her. Clara realized then that her safety was Silas's only weapon. As long as she was a hostage, Silas had power. As long as she was a victim, he was in control. She closed her eyes for a second. She thought of the veil. She thought of the cage. No more. Clara opened her eyes. She looked at Luke and gave a barely perceptible nod. She didn't struggle. She didn't try to hit the gun. She simply let her weight drop. She went limp, sagging toward the ground. Silas, expecting resistance, stumbled. His grip on her hair slipped. In that fraction of a second, Clara twisted. She didn't run away. She stepped away. She stepped into the open space. Putting 2 feet of air between herself and Silas, she turned to face him, her chest heaving. "Shoot me, then," she said. Silas blinked, the gun wavering. "Shoot me," Clara shouted, her voice ringing off the barn walls. "Do it in front of them all. Show them exactly what you are." Silas stared at her. He saw a woman who was no longer afraid to die, and that terrified him. If he shot her now, in cold blood, with a U.S. Marshal watching, he would hang before the sun went down. There would be no trial, no lawyers. The men in the yard would tear him apart. He had built his life on coercion, on hidden threats, on violence done in the dark. He could not function in the light. He hesitated. That hesitation was his end. "Drop it," Luke roared. He drew his gun. Marshal Vance drew his 10 rifles from the Garrett men leveled at Silas. Silas looked at the wall of steel facing him. He looked at Clara, standing alone in the dirt, magnificent and untouchable in her defiance. He looked at Luke, who was waiting for a reason, any reason, to pull the trigger. Silas Crow let out a sound that was half sob, half curse. His hand opened. The revolver fell into the dust. The marshal's men were on him in seconds. They slammed him into the side of the barn, twisting his arms behind his back. The click of handcuffs was the loudest sound in the world. Clara stood trembling. The adrenaline was leaving her knees weak. Luke holstered his gun. He walked over to her. He didn't run. He walked with a limp, but he closed the distance. He didn't touch her. He stopped 2 feet away, respecting the space she had claimed. "Are you hurt?" he asked hoarsely. Clara shook her head. "No." She looked at Silas as the deputies hauled him toward the marshal's wagon. He was shouting threats, promising retribution, but no one was listening. He was just a man in handcuffs now. Sheriff Baines tried to sneak away toward the stables, but Vance gestured to his men. 2 of Garrett's cowboys intercepted the sheriff, relieving him of his gun belt with rough efficiency. It was done. The fortress had fallen, but as the dust settled, the reality of the aftermath set in. The townspeople and the buyers watched Clara. They didn't cheer. They whispered. She turned on her husband. One man muttered, Lived in the same house with the foreman while her husband was away. Another said, "You know what that means." Clara heard them. She lifted her chin. She knew she would never be respectable again. She was the woman who had brought down the Baron. She was the woman with the ruined past and the scandalous present. She looked at Luke. Marshal Vance walked over to them. He looked at Luke with a heavy expression. "You kept your word." Mercer, Vance said. "I did." Luke said. Vance nodded. "And I have to keep mine. You confessed to a felony. Participation in the death of the Miller family." "I know," Luke said. "Luke," Clara said, stepping forward. "No." Luke turned to her. He took her hands. This time, he didn't care who was watching. "I have to. Clara, I can't build a life on a foundation that is rotten. I have to pay the debt. But you saved me," Clara said, tears finally spilling over. "And you saved me," Luke said. "You made me want to be a man who doesn't have to look at the ground." He looked at Vance. "I am ready. Marshal." Vance nodded. "I will take you to Helena. The judge will hear the case, given your cooperation and the coercion by Crow. I suspect the sentence will be light. A year, maybe 2, in the territorial prison. But you have to serve it." "I will wait," Clara said instantly. Luke looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "It's a hard life, waiting for a convict. The town won't be kind to you." "I don't care about the town," Clara said. "I care about the truth." She reached up and touched the scar on his cheek. "I will run the ranch," she said. "I will fight the bank. I will be standing right here when you come back." Luke smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile without a shadow behind it. "I believe you," he said. The deputies led Silas Crow away, loading him into the wagon like a sack of grain. Marshal Vance gestured for Luke to follow. Luke mounted his horse. He couldn't ride with Clara. He had to ride with the law. The procession moved out. The buyers dispersed, grumbling about wasted time. The dust began to settle on the Iron Ridge Ranch. Clara stood in the center of the yard. She was alone. The wind whipped her hair across her face. Her dress was stained with dust and sweat. The veil she had worn on her wedding day was gone, destroyed weeks ago. Her face was uncovered, exposed to the harsh sun and the judgment of the world. She watched Luke ride away. He turned in the saddle once, just before he crested the ridge. He raised his hand. Clara raised hers. She was shaking. Her future was uncertain. The money was gone. Her reputation was in tatters. And the man she loved was going to prison. But as she looked out at the miles of open prairie, at the fences that no longer felt like a cage, Clara Hart took a deep breath. The air tasted of sagebrush and cold earth. It tasted of freedom. She straightened her spine. She turned and walked back toward the house, not as a guest, not as a prisoner, but as the owner. She had survived the winter. Now, she would build the spring. The wheels of justice in the Montana Territory did not turn with the precision of a Swiss clock. They ground forward with the agonizing slowness of a wagon axle stripped of grease. Silas Crow was sitting in the territorial prison in Deer Lodge, awaiting a trial that kept being postponed by expensive lawyers and winter storms. But his shadow still lay long and cold across the Iron Ridge Ranch. It was October now. The golden light of autumn was fading into the gray steel of early winter. The cottonwoods along the creek had dropped their leaves, standing like skeletal fingers against the sky. Clara Crow sat at the kitchen table, the ledger open before her. It was not the Black Book of Crimes. That was locked in the marshal's safe in Helena, but the ranch ledger, the numbers were bleak. The legal battle to prove that the ranch belonged to her, and not to the assets of a criminal husband, was draining every dollar she had. The cattle sale had been halted by the arrest. The bank accounts were frozen. She looked out the window. Luke Mercer was down in the main corral, breaking ice on the water trough. Marshal Vance had released him on his own recognizance, pending the trial, with the specific instruction that he was to ensure the key witness, Clara, stayed alive until she could testify. It was a mercy, but a heavy one. Luke worked 18 hours a day, driving himself into the ground as if exhaustion could scrub the guilt from his skin. The ranch hands, men who drifted like tumbleweeds, were growing restless. They needed food, and they needed wages. Clara put down her pen. She wrapped a heavy shawl around her shoulders and walked out to the bunkhouse. The men stopped talking when she entered. The air smelled of wet wool and tobacco. "I cannot pay you in full this week," Clara said, her voice steady. "The bank in Bannock is still holding the funds." A man named Pike, a sour-faced drifter, spat on the floor. "We cannot eat promises, Mrs. Crow. And we don't much like working for a woman whose husband is in irons." "Then you may leave," Clara said. "I will write you a note of credit for what you are owed. You can take it to the merchant in town. He will honor it against the spring calf crop." Pike sneered. "And if there ain't no spring crop, if the bank takes it all, then you will have lost a week's wages," Clara said, meeting his eyes. "And I will have lost my life. Those are the stakes. If you stay, you get fed. If you go, you go." Pike stared at her, then looked away. He didn't leave. Clara nodded once and walked out. She had learned that authority was not about volume. It was about the refusal to flinch. But the ranch was the easy part. The town was the gauntlet. 2 days later, Clara rode into Bannock for supplies. Luke rode with her, keeping a distance of 20 yards, his rifle across his saddle. He was her guardian, but he refused to be seen as her partner. He believed his proximity tainted her. Clara walked into the general store. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful sound that died instantly in the heavy silence of the room. 2 women from the church committee were examining bolts of calico. They looked up, saw Clara, and turned their backs in unison. "Did you hear?" one whispered loudly. "They say she conspired with the foreman. They say she planned it all to steal the money. A Jezebel." The other agreed. Clara walked past them. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she did not lower her head. She picked up a sack of flour and a tin of coffee. She placed them on the counter. Mr. Henderson, the shopkeeper who had spoken up for her, looked uncomfortable. "That'll be $2. Mrs. Crow," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. Before Clara could reach for her coin purse, a hand covered hers on the counter. It was a man named Miller, no relation to the tragedy, a wealthy land speculator who had often done business with Silas. He was smiling, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Put your money away." "Clara," Miller said, "a woman in your position shouldn't be worrying about bills." Clara pulled her hand back as if she had touched a hot stove. "My position? A husband in jail, a ranch falling apart," Miller said, leaning closer. "It is a lonely place out there. You need a friend, someone with resources. I could make sure the bank releases those funds." "And what would that cost?" Clara asked, her voice ice. Miller's gaze dropped to her bodice, then back to her face. "Just a little hospitality. A warm welcome when I ride out." The store went silent. Everyone was listening. They expected the shamed wife to be grateful. They expected her to take the lifeline, no matter how greasy the rope. Clara looked at him. She looked at the women who were pretending not to listen. "My hospitality is for friends. Mr. Miller," Clara said clearly. "My business is for the law, and my time is my own. I am not for sale. Not by Silas Crow, and certainly not by a vulture like you." She slammed the coins onto the counter. "Good day, Mr. Henderson." She walked out, her boots loud on the floorboards. She trembled only when she reached the wagon, but it was the trembling of adrenaline, not fear. She had learned that saying no was a muscle, and she was exercising it. The ride back was quiet. Luke watched the horizon, his jaw set. When they reached the ranch, he didn't unsaddle her horse. He stood by the gate, looking at the ground. "You should let me go." "Clara," he said. Clara froze. "We discussed this." Marshal Vance said. "To hell with Vance," Luke said, looking up. His eyes were tormented. "Did you see them in town? Did you hear what they called you? As long as I am here, you are the foreman's woman. You are the wife who plotted with a killer. I am a stain on you." "Clara, I don't care what they say," Clara said. "You will," Luke said, "when the winter gets hard. When you need neighbors to help with the roundup and no one comes. I am poison to a decent life. You could sell the ranch, start over somewhere else. Without me, Clara walked over to him. She grabbed the lapels of his coat and yanked him down until they were face to face. "Do not dare," she hissed. "Do not dare decide what is good for me." Luke looked stunned. "For 6 months. Men have told me what I am worth," Clara said. "Silas told me I was property. The town tells me I am a scandal. And now you want to tell me I am a victim who needs to be protected from her own choices." She let him go, stepping back. "I am not keeping you because I am afraid, Luke, and I am not keeping you because the marshal ordered it. I am keeping you because you are the only man I have ever known who knows how to build something instead of just taking it." Luke stared at her. The wind whipped his dark hair across his forehead. "I am a criminal. Clara, so am I. In their eyes," Clara said. "So we build our own world, a world where we tell the truth, where we work until our hands bleed, but we sleep at night." She pointed to the house. "Put your horse away. Luke, we have fences to mend." Luke didn't leave. He nodded slowly, and for the first time, the look he gave her wasn't one of apology. It was one of respect. They fell into a rhythm. It wasn't a romance of flowers and poetry. It was a romance of survival. They woke before dawn. They rode the range, checking for strays. They ate simple meals in the kitchen, talking about feed prices and winter wheat. They didn't touch often. The boundaries were clear, but the intimacy was there, in the way Luke would sharpen her knife without being asked, in the way Clara would leave the lantern burning when he was out late. It was a relationship grounded in choice. Every day they stayed was a day they chose each other over the easy exit. But the past has long claws, and Silas Crow was not finished. It happened in November, on the night of the first hard freeze. Clara woke to the sound of breaking glass. She sat up, her heart hammering. The smell of smoke hit her instantly. Acrid, choking kerosene smoke. She grabbed her robe and ran to the window. The barn was on fire. "Luke!" she screamed. She ran downstairs, grabbing the shotgun from the rack by the door. She burst out onto the porch. The barn was a wall of orange flame, lighting up the night. The horses were screaming, trapped inside. Luke was already there. He was running toward the barn doors, a wet blanket thrown over his head. Clara ran to the pump, filling buckets. Suddenly, a shot rang out. It hit the dirt inches from Clara's feet. She dropped the bucket and threw herself behind the water trough. A sniper. From the darkness of the ridge, a voice called out, "Let it burn! Mrs. Crow! Silas sends his regards." It wasn't a random attack. It was an execution. Silas had hired men to finish what the law wouldn't. Luke came stumbling out of the barn, leading 2 terrified horses. He slapped their rumps, sending them galloping into the dark. "Get to the creek," Luke roared at her. Another shot chipped the wood of the trough. Clara didn't argue. She crawled through the mud, keeping the trough between her and the ridge. She reached the edge of the creek bed and slid down the embankment. Luke slid down beside her a moment later. His face was blackened with soot, his eyebrows singed. "There are 2 of them," he gasped. "On the east ridge. They have the high ground. If we stay here, they will flank us." "Where do we go?" Clara asked. "The Badlands," Luke said. "We have to cross the river and get into the rocks. It's the only cover." The river was swollen with icy slush. They ran, bent double, using the willow brush for cover. They could hear the men shouting behind them, crashing through the brush. "There they go, by the willows!" Bullets tore through the branches. They reached the riverbank. The water was black and fast. "Swim?" Clara asked, looking at the deadly current. "No," Luke said. "The ford is too deep. We have to jump the narrows." He pointed to a spot where the river cut through a narrow gorge. The gap was 8 feet wide, on a dry day. A risky jump, on an icy night, with gunmen behind them. It was madness. Luke went first. He backed up, sprinted, and launched himself. He landed hard on the far rock, slipping, scrambling, barely catching his balance. "Throw me the gun!" he shouted. Clara tossed the shotgun across the gap. Luke caught it. "Jump! Clara! Now!" Clara heard the crunch of boots in the snow behind her. She didn't look back. She ran. She hit the edge of the rock and pushed with everything she had. For a second, she was flying over the black water. She hit the other side. Her boots slipped on the ice. She fell backward. Luke's hand shot out. He grabbed her wrist. His grip was iron. He hauled her up onto the rock just as a bullet sparked off the stone where her head had been. "Move!" They scrambled up into the rocks, disappearing into the labyrinth of sandstone towers just as the moon slid behind a cloud. They spent the night playing cat and mouse in the freezing dark. It was a test of every instinct Luke possessed, and every ounce of grit Clara had forged. They were hunted. They were freezing. But they were together. Near dawn, they found a dead end, a box canyon with no exit. "They are coming," Luke whispered. He checked the shotgun. 2 shells left. He looked at Clara. "If they take us," he said, his voice cracking, "I won't let them take you alive, not with what Silas paid them to do." Clara looked at the shotgun. Then she looked at the narrow entrance of the canyon. "Give me the gun," she said. "Clara, you are hurt. Luke, your hands are shaking from the smoke. Mine aren't." She held out her hand. Luke hesitated. It went against every instinct he had to give up the weapon, but he looked at her eyes. They were the eyes of the woman who had walked into the courtroom. He handed her the gun. Clara positioned herself behind a fallen boulder. She rested the barrel on the stone. She breathed out, watching her breath plume in the cold air. A shadow moved at the canyon mouth, a man in a duster, holding a repeating rifle. Clara didn't wait for him to speak. She didn't wait for him to see them. She aimed for the knee. She pulled the trigger. The boom was deafening. The man screamed and went down. His legs shattered. The second man broke cover, trying to run. Clara pumped the action. She swung the barrel. She fired the second barrel into the rocks just ahead of him. "Drop it!" she screamed, "or the next one is in your back." The man froze. He dropped his rifle. Luke was on him in seconds, tackling him, binding his hands with his own belt. Clara stood up. She lowered the smoking gun. She was trembling now, violent, racking shivers. But she hadn't missed. She hadn't waited to be rescued. Luke walked over to her. He took the gun gently from her hands. "You got him," he whispered. "We got him," Clara said. They marched the men back to town at gunpoint. The arrival of Clara Crow, soot-stained and fierce, marching 2 hired killers into the marshal's office, became a legend that would be told in Bannock for 50 years. The testimony of the hired gunmen was the final nail in Silas Crow's coffin. It wasn't just financial crimes anymore. It was attempted murder of a witness. The trial, when it finally happened in December, was short. Luke took the stand. He sat in the chair, looking at the jury. He didn't hide his face. "I did those things," Luke said to the packed courtroom. "I cut the fences. I intimidated the families. I did it because I was a coward who valued his paycheck more than his soul." The prosecutor, a sharp man from Helena, leaned in. "And why are you confessing now, Mr. Mercer? You could have ridden away." Luke looked at Clara, sitting in the front row. She was wearing a simple gray dress, her head high. "Because I met someone who taught me that the truth is the only thing that doesn't burn," Luke said. Silas Crow was sentenced to 20 years in the Territorial Penitentiary. He was dragged out of the courtroom screaming that he owned them all. He owned nothing. Luke was sentenced to 1 year suspended, with 5 years of probation. In light of his testimony and his role in capturing the assassins, it was a light sentence by the law's standard, but heavy by the town's. He was a convicted man. He would never vote. He would never hold office. But as he walked out of the courthouse, a free man, Clara was waiting. The winter passed. It was hard. They lost 20 head of cattle to the cold. They ate venison and cornmeal for 3 months. But the barn was rebuilt, timber by timber. Spring came to the Montana Territory with a violence of green grass and rushing water. On a warm evening in May, Clara stood on the porch of the ranch house. The wind was blowing, but it was a Chinook, warm and smelling of sage. Luke was repairing the corral fence. He finished hammering a post and walked toward the house. He took off his hat, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. "The fence is solid," he said. "Good," Clara said. She walked down the steps. She stopped on the bottom one, so she was eye level with him. The whispers in town have stopped. She said, mostly, they found new things to talk about. Luke said. Clara reached out and took his hand. His knuckles were still scarred, his palm rough. I don't want to just survive anymore. Luke, she said softly. Luke looked at her. His dark eyes searched hers. What do you want, Clara? I want to live. I want a life that we choose. Every day. Luke stepped closer. He placed his other hand on her waist. It wasn't a claim. It was an anchor. I have nothing to give you but my hands and my name, he said, and the name isn't worth much. It is worth everything to me, Clara said. She leaned in and kissed him. It was a kiss of daylight. It was a kiss that held the memory of the cold cave, the terror of the fire, and the quiet peace of the morning coffee. It was tender and intense, a promise made not in blood, but in hope. Luke pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. He buried his face in her hair. I am here, he whispered. I know, Clara said. They stood together as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in gold and violet. The land around them was harsh. The wind would always be cruel. The winters would always be long. There were no guarantees in the West, but the veil was gone. The cage was broken. They stood in the open air, unhidden. Two people who had walked through the dark to find the light in each other. And that, in a world that tried to crush the weak, was the victory. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Clara and Luke through the wilds of the Montana Territory. It has been a pleasure to bring this tale of resilience and redemption to life for you. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below and share your location. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more tales of the frontier, where love and survival go hand in hand. Finally, I would appreciate hearing your thoughts on the story. Did Clara's choice resonate with you? Did Luke find the redemption he sought? Please share your thoughts in English in the comments section. Safe travels, and until we meet again on the trail.